Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of Pop Culture English. It has been a while. Over the past couple months, I have been busy with school exams. Now that I am free, though, I will be trying to release podcast episodes more often, beginning with this one. Today, we will be discussing what is possibly the most famous English tragedy ever, which is, of course, Romeo and Juliet. I am sure that you know about Romeo and Juliet in one way or another. Although it was written by William Shakespeare over 400 years ago, the play still influences popular culture to this day. Hopefully, you know who William Shakespeare is. But if you don't, he is basically considered to be the greatest writer of the English language. More specifically, and more accurately, he is the greatest playwright of the English language. A playwright is just someone who writes plays or theater. It's actually in the name. Playwright is just a combination of the words play and write. And Romeo and Juliet is one of Shakespeare's most famous works, alongside other tragedies such as Hamlet and Macbeth. What is a tragedy, by the way? I've used this word a couple times already. A tragedy is just a play with a sad or tragic ending. This word can also be used to describe real-world events as well. For example, the death of a great person can be called a tragedy. Now, I know that the topic of today's podcast is a bit different from the topics of the previous two episodes. Shakespeare isn't exactly a modern author, and Romeo and Juliet isn't exactly a modern play. But, as I mentioned earlier, the play still influences modern culture even though it is so old. In fact, many plays, books, and movies today have the same storyline as Romeo and Juliet. For example, West Side Story was a very popular musical in the 1950s, which set Romeo and Juliet's story in 20th century America. A musical is just a play with songs, by the way. I talked about musicals in the first episode of this podcast on K-pop Demon Hunters. But unlike K-pop Demon Hunters, which is a musical movie, West Side Story was actually a musical set on stage with actors performing in real time. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. Before we talk about how Romeo and Juliet influences our modern culture, I think that it is useful for us to talk about what the play is actually about. Romeo and Juliet is set in Italy. in a city called Verona. In this city, there are two noble families. A noble is someone who belonged to the upper class back in the day. So nobles were kings, dukes, or lords who owned castles and had a lot of money and had servants and everything. In Verona, there were these two noble families. One was called the Montagues, and the other was called the Capulets. And these two families hate each other. However, a young man from the Montague family called Romeo falls in love with a girl from the Capulet family called Juliet. Because of the hatred between their two families, the two cannot marry or even be seen together. Over the course of the play, things get worse and worse. Romeo accidentally kills Juliet's cousin Tybalt in a duel. Juliet tries to escape the marriage her family plans for her by taking a drug that will make her seem dead. Romeo believes that Juliet has actually died and kills himself because of his grief. Finally, Juliet wakes up from her fake death, finds Romeo dead beside her, and stabs herself with his knife. So basically, they both end up dying for the sake of their love. Now that you know the story of Romeo and Juliet, you can probably start to recognize how it appears so often in the media we consume. By the way, media just refers to all the books, movies, plays, songs, and other things that are created by our society. And in English, we like to use the verb consume with it. So, for example, I can say that I like to consume social media. I think the reason why Romeo and Juliet is so common and so widespread in modern culture is because of how relatable and engaging the story is. People living nowadays experience the same emotions of love that people experienced when the play was first written 400 years ago. Over the years, authors have adapted Romeo and Juliet to reflect their own societies and to reflect their own cultural concerns. For example, West Side Story, which I mentioned earlier, swaps the hatred between the noble families of the Montagues and Capulets for violence between white gangs and Puerto Rican gangs. Thus, it explores issues of immigration and gang violence, which were pretty important in 1950s America. The story of Romeo and Juliet is so powerful that different cultures even have their own versions of the story. For example, there is a story in Chinese culture called The Butterfly Lovers, which is also about two lovers who die because their love is forbidden by society. In fact, Romeo and Juliet is the reason romantic tragedy is a popular genre today. A romantic tragedy is just a tragedy about love, by the way. Romance is just another word for love. If you've ever watched the movie Titanic, watched The Fault in Our Stars, or read The Great Gatsby, then you actually owe your enjoyment to Romeo and Juliet. All the books and movies I gave as examples above are romantic tragedies. But before Shakespeare's time, the genre of romantic tragedy didn't exist. Romance was the subject of comedy, which is the opposite of tragedy. A comedy is a work that makes you laugh. It was only because of Romeo and Juliet that romantic tragedy became a popular genre, and works such as Titanic were created. That brings me to the end of today's podcast. Again, I know this is a rather unusual topic, but I hope it's still entertaining and informative. As always, if you have any feedback, please let me know. And until next time.